She is crouched on a Calcutta street, both arms wrapped around a clay pot that holds nothing. Around her, bodies, not soldiers, not the wounded, mothers, children, old men who walked for days from villages that no longer had food. The city smells of rot and of fear, and the war is happening somewhere else, in the Pacific, in North Africa, in the gilded rooms where men draw lines on maps. Here, the war is a bowl of rice that no longer exists. This is Bengal, 1943. Monsoon heat, river delta, one of the most fertile regions on Earth, and 3 million people are about to starve to death. It didn't have to happen. The granaries weren't empty. The land hadn't failed. What failed was the machinery of empire. British authorities, fearing Japanese invasion, seized the boats, the lifeline of internal food transport in a region threaded by rivers. When Burma fell, rice imports vanished. A cyclone destroyed the harvest, and then inflation, the slow predator, priced basic food beyond reach for anyone who worked with their hands. Merchants hoarded, speculators profited. And in London, Winston Churchill's government looked at the numbers and decided the math worked out. War rationing came first and Bengal could wait. Food was exported to England while the bodies piled up in Calcutta's streets. 3 million dead. Not from drought, not from blight, from a decision. In 2026, as climate stress fractures global food systems and hunger is once again being used as a weapon, the lesson is stark. Famine wears a human face, and that face is often a bureaucrat's. Bengal starved because men in London decided the math worked out. But what happens when the disaster isn't policy? It's physics gone catastrophically wrong. In Ukraine, 1986, something was already burning that no one was supposed to know about. It is 1:23 in the morning. Reactor 4 is running a safety test. The engineers have done the math. The procedure should take minutes. What happens instead takes seconds. A power surge, the designers said, was physically impossible. Tears through the core. The 2,000-ton concrete and steel lid of the reactor blows clean off the top of the building. What rises from the open shaft is not smoke. It is the inside of an atom, briefly and catastrophically introduced to the night sky. Pripyat is a model Soviet city. Neon signs, a Ferris wheel, parks designed with pride. 50,000 people are asleep. A few of them wake up and walk to their balconies to watch what looks like a beautiful blue light rising over the horizon. Some bring their children to see it. The light is ionizing radiation. They don't know that yet. The first responders arrive thinking it is a roof fire. They are not wearing radiation suits. They receive lethal doses within minutes and begin vomiting before they finish unrolling the hoses. It takes 36 hours to evacuate Pripyat. Officials debate the optics. The word radiation is kept off the radio. Over the following months, hundreds of thousands of liquidators, miners, soldiers, and civilian workers are sent into the exclusion zone to contain what cannot truly be contained. They are given medals and told the doses they're receiving are within safe limits. Many will spend the rest of their lives disputing that. 400 times more radiation than the Hiroshima bomb. Land uninhabitable for centuries. A city that still stands empty in 2026, the Ferris wheel still there, waiting for no one. In 2026, as nuclear power re-enters the climate conversation with renewed urgency, Chernobyl remains the most powerful argument on both sides of the debate simultaneously. It is a case study in catastrophic design failure, compounded by a political system that had made institutional honesty structurally impossible. Chernobyl showed what happens when a government weaponizes secrecy against its own people. But there's a darker story, one where the secrecy wasn't accidental. It was the entire point. Japan, 1937. They gave the prisoners a name. Maruta. Logs, not soldiers, not inmates, and not people. Logs, because logs are cut, tested, and discarded without ceremony, without record, without the inconvenience of a name. This is Pingfang, Manchuria, 1937. From the outside, the complex is unremarkable, a water purification facility, according to the official designation. Behind the walls, operating tables, iron cages, and a program of human experimentation so systematic it had its own budget line in the Imperial Army's accounts. Surgeon General Shiro Ishii had a theory. He believed biological warfare would define the next century of conflict, and he believed that theory could only be tested on live subjects. The Imperial Army gave him everything he needed. What followed was not science. It was industrial cruelty with a laboratory aesthetic. Prisoners, Chinese, Soviet, Korean, and Allied POWs, were infected deliberately with plague, cholera, and typhoid to measure transmission rates. They were subjected to vivisection without anesthesia, some while fully conscious, organs removed to study the progression of disease in real time. They were used as live targets for grenades and flamethrowers. They were exposed to extreme cold to chart frostbite progression. They were given no name but the one that meant nothing at all. As Soviet forces advanced in August 1945, Ishii ordered the facility destroyed, evidence burned, surviving prisoners executed. The Maruta files, to the extent they survived at all, traveled west. The United States government, recognizing the data's military value, granted Ishii and his team immunity from war crimes prosecution in exchange for access to the research. They would never stand trial. Many built comfortable careers in post-war Japan, in medicine, in academia, in industry. In 2026, every research ethics protocol in existence, every informed consent form, every clinical trial safeguard, every institutional review board, is in part a monument to what happened at Pingfang. Not because we remember it well, because we almost buried it entirely. Unit 731 operated on the premise that some lives exist only to generate data. Thousands of miles away, a different system operated on the same logic, but dressed it in classrooms, hymns, and government funding. A child is handed to strangers at a train station. She is 7 years old. She will not see her mother again for 6 years. When she returns, she will no longer speak her language. When her mother reaches for her, neither of them will know how to begin. This is Canada, 1880s through 1996. Not a single country, not a single moment. A system funded by the federal government, operated by churches, built on a policy that its architects stated plainly: kill the Indian, save the man. The residential schools spanned the country, more than 130 facilities, dormitories with cold floors, silence enforced at mealtimes, haircut on the first day, always. Children arrived speaking Cree, Ojibwe, Inuktitut, Mi'kmaq, and were beaten for it. The language was not merely discouraged, it was treated as a symptom of something that needed to be removed. What the government documents record as assimilation, survivors record as something closer to dismantling. Identity stripped in layers, name, language, family, cosmology, the entire architecture of a self replaced with institutionalized forgetting. The abuse was not incidental to the system. It was permitted by the system, documented, reported, and consistently deprioritized against the larger goal. Children died, of disease, of neglect, of violence, and were buried in unmarked graves. Families were never told. Some families searched for decades. In 2021, ground-penetrating radar confirmed what survivors had been saying for years. The graves were real. The number of the dead is still being counted. This was not ancient history. The last residential school closed in 1996, the same year the internet went mainstream. The trauma it inflicted is not historical, it is biological, intergenerational, and still actively shaping the lives of Indigenous communities across Canada in 2026. Canada built its system on quiet, bureaucratic erasure. In Indonesia in 1965, the erasure wasn't quiet at all. It was swift, and it was cheered. The rivers ran red. Locals would later recall bodies so thick in the water they jammed the irrigation gates of rice paddies. In the villages, neighbors killed neighbors. In the cities, lists circulated. The government didn't call it a massacre. It called it salvation. Indonesia, 1965. The Cold War has turned the archipelago into a pressure cooker. President Sukarno is performing an increasingly unstable balancing act between the army and the Indonesian Communist Party, the PKY, third largest communist party on earth. The army is watching, waiting. On the night of September 30th, a group of junior military officers kills 6 senior generals in what they describe as a preemptive strike against a coup. By morning, General Suharto has neutralized the plotters and begun attributing the entire operation to the PKY. The attribution is convenient. It is also never conclusively proven. What follows is one of the most rapid and comprehensive political purges of the 20th century. Teachers, farmers, labor union organizers, artists, intellectuals, anyone carrying a communist affiliation, real or alleged, is targeted. The army provides the infrastructure. Local militias provide the manpower. In some villages, the killing is done by hand. Between 500,000 and 1 million people are killed in less than a year. The estimates vary because the records were never kept and the bodies were never formally counted. The rivers carried what the land couldn't absorb. Western governments, including the United States, watched and quietly approved. Jakarta had just swung from the Soviet orbit. The math, from Washington's perspective, worked out. Suharto ruled for 30 years. The killings remained a taboo subject inside Indonesia for decades. They are still barely taught in Western classrooms. In 2026, as authoritarian governments once again test the threshold of acceptable mass violence, Indonesia 1965 is a case study in how atrocity gets laundered into politics, and how quickly the world moves on when the ideological alignment is favorable. The Indonesian tragedy was political and swift. The partition of India, just 18 years earlier, was also political. But its violence was neighbor against neighbor, something ancient, something that left wounds still bleeding in 2026. A British lawyer who had never been to India was handed a map and given 5 weeks to draw a line through the lives of 14 million people. He finished ahead of schedule. He never returned to see what the line had done. Cyril Radcliffe arrived in India in July 1947 with no prior knowledge of the subcontinent's geography, its religious communities, its rivers, or the villages that sat astride the boundaries he was drawing. He worked from outdated census data in a sealed room in New Delhi, in the heat of an Indian summer, producing in 5 weeks a border that would define 2 nations, 2 armies, and 3 subsequent wars. August 14th and 15th, 1947. Independence arrives across the subcontinent simultaneously, wrapped in jubilation and in dread. The British leave. The borders materialize. And 14 million people discover, almost overnight, that they are now on the wrong side. Muslims move toward Pakistan. Hindus and Sikhs move toward India. The migrations flow in both directions at once, along the same roads, through the same train stations, across the same Punjab plains that have been home to all of them for centuries. Religious violence erupts along the migration routes with a speed and ferocity that surprises even those who had feared it. Trains arrive at their destinations carrying nothing but the dead. Villages that had coexisted for generations turn on themselves in days. Up to 2 million people are killed in the communal slaughter. 14 million displaced. The largest forced migration in recorded human history at that point in time. India and Pakistan have fought 3 wars since. A 4th has come close more than once. Kashmir remains one of the most heavily militarized regions on Earth. 2 nuclear-armed states stare at each other across a line drawn in 5 weeks by a man who caught the next flight home. In 2026, that border still bleeds. Partition showed that even freedom can arrive wrapped in catastrophe. But not all disasters carry geopolitical grandeur. Some fall on small towns, some fall on school children. On a rainy morning in Wales, a mountain moved. It was 9:15 in the morning. Lessons had just started. The children were working on arithmetic. Then the mountain came down. Aberfan is a mining village in South Wales. Terraced houses, tight streets, a community built around the coal industry and entirely at its mercy. Above the village, the National Coal Board had spent decades depositing mining waste in tips on the hillside. Tip 7 loomed over Pantglas Junior School. It had been constructed on top of underground springs. This was known. It was in the surveys. It crossed the right desks. Nothing was done. Days of heavy rain saturated the tip beyond the point of cohesion. On the morning of October 21, 1966, 140,000 cubic yards of coal slurry detached from the hillside and moved downward at speed. It hit the school in seconds. 116 children were killed. Most were between 7 and 10 years old. 28 adults died with them. The village lost an entire generation in a single morning. Parents came with bare hands and dug at the rubble for days. The rescuers worked in silence because noise might trigger further movement and because there was nothing adequate to say. Most of the children recovered from the slurry were found at their desks. The inquiry was unambiguous. The National Coal Board bore sole and complete responsibility. The warnings had been sitting in filing cabinets. The springs were on the maps. The risk had been assessed and shelved. The government forced Aberfan to contribute its own disaster fund toward the cost of removing the remaining tips. It took 30 years for that money to be repaid. In 2026, as climate early warning systems remain chronically underfunded and as infrastructure reports gather dust in municipal offices around the world, Aberfan has not finished speaking. Ignored warnings do not expire. They wait. Aberfan's mountain was made by industry. 60 years earlier in America, it was water itself, the oldest and wildest force on the continent, that exposed exactly who matters when the levees break. They dynamited their own levee. Not because it was the safest option, not because the engineering demanded it, because the people downstream were poor, black, and politically invisible. The math, to the men who made the decision, was that simple. Spring 1927. The Mississippi River Basin has absorbed a year of record rainfall and is running at pressures the levee system, sold to the public as modern, as foolproof, as a permanent solution to an ancient problem, was never truly designed to hold. Engineers watch the gauges. The gauges do not lie. On April the 21st, the Mounds Landing levee breaks. The wall of water that comes through floods an area the size of New England. It moves across the Delta Flats at a pace that leaves no time for those without vehicles, without warning, without high ground. Which is to say, the people who were always going to be left behind. In New Orleans, city officials and business interests grow anxious. The river is still rising. They petition the federal government to allow them to dynamite the Carnarvon levee south of the city, deliberately flooding the downstream parishes of St. Bernard and Plaquemines to relieve pressure on New Orleans. The downstream parishes are rural. Their populations are predominantly black sharecroppers. They are promised compensation. They receive almost none of it. The Carnarvon levee is blown on April the 29th. New Orleans is spared. The parishes below it are submerged. African-American flood victims across the Delta are herded into refugee camps run by the Red Cross and policed by the National Guard. Reports of forced labor, men prevented from leaving the camps until the plantation owners who controlled them gave permission, circulate in the black press and are largely ignored by the white one. Herbert Hoover runs the federal relief effort with conspicuous efficiency and conspicuous blindness to the racial architecture of the disaster. He leverages the publicity into a presidential campaign. It works. From 1927 to Katrina to the flooding patterns of 2026, who gets saved first and who gets dynamited has never been an accident in America. It has always been a policy decision dressed as an emergency. The Mississippi showed that in America, some lives get sacrificed so others can be saved. In Oklahoma, 4 years before the flood, no natural disaster was needed at all. Just a mob, a match, and official silence. They called it Black Wall Street. 35 blocks of black-owned banks, law offices, hospitals, hotels, and theatres, built inside a country that insisted, at every level of its culture and its law, that black prosperity was an impossibility. Greenwood had been built anyway. On May 31, 1921, Tulsa burned it to the ground. Dick Rowland was 19 years old, a shoeshiner who used the elevator in the Drexel building because the whites-only restroom on the ground floor was not available to him. On May 30th, he was accused by Sarah Page, the elevator operator, of assault. The details were murky then, and remain murky now. The charges were later dropped. None of that would matter. The Tulsa Tribune ran the story. The white mob began assembling outside the courthouse before nightfall. A group of armed black veterans, men who had fought in the First World War for a country that did not treat them as citizens, arrived to prevent a lynching. Shots were fired. The sequence of who fired first has never been definitively established. It didn't matter. The mob had its permission. The assault on Greenwood began in the early hours of June 1st. The Tulsa Police Department deputized members of the white mob and joined in. Private aircraft, biplanes, flew over the district firing on residents and, by some survivor accounts, dropping incendiary devices. 35 square blocks were burned. An estimated 300 people were killed. 10,000 black residents were displaced. Some were marched through the streets at gunpoint to internment camps set up at the fairgrounds. The National Guard arrived and arrested black residents, not the mob, not the men with the torches, not the deputies who had participated, but the survivors. Greenwood was never compensated. The massacre was systematically suppressed from local and national history for decades. Survivors were instructed to stay silent. It was omitted from school curricula. Many Tulsans alive in 1970 claimed to have no knowledge that it had occurred. In 2026, the conversation about reparations and the racial wealth gap runs directly through this rubble, not as metaphor, but as a specific and documented act of economic destruction that was never repaired. Tulsa was erased from American memory for nearly a century. But the Aleutian Rebellion, a catastrophe so vast it reshaped an entire civilization, has been absent from Western consciousness for even longer. The Tang dynasty was the most powerful empire on earth. Chang'an was the largest city in the world. A metropolis of 1 million people, a terminus of the Silk Road, a place where Persian merchants, Tibetan diplomats, Japanese scholars, and Sogdian merchants moved through the same markets on the same afternoon. The Tang court was writing poetry that would not be surpassed for 1,000 years, and then An Lushan came down from the north. He was a Turco-Sogdian general, of enormous physical presence and considerable political intelligence, a man who had cultivated the favor of Emperor Xuanzong for years, performing the role of the loyal frontier commander with enough skill to be given the military command of 3 of the empire's most critical border regions simultaneously. The court's factional infighting had blinded it to the accumulation of power the emperor's trust had made possible. In 755 AD, An Lushan declared himself emperor of a rival dynasty and marched his frontier armies toward the imperial heartland. Chang'an fell. Emperor Xuanzong fled south in humiliation, an image so catastrophic to the imperial mystique that court poets would be processing its shame for generations. What followed was 8 years of civil war that moved across the most densely populated region of the medieval world like a slow catastrophe, consuming everything in its path. The Tang survived, but only by calling in foreign armies, Uyghur forces, among others, whose help would carry its own political costs for decades. The empire that emerged from the rebellion was fractured, diminished, and fundamentally transformed. The census records that survived suggest a population loss of up to 36 million people. Not all were killed directly. War, famine, displacement, and the total collapse of the agricultural infrastructure that had sustained the dynasty all took their toll in overlapping waves. The proportional loss, relative to the world population of the time, may make the Aleutian Rebellion the single deadliest conflict in human history. Most people in the West have never heard of it. In 2026, as scholars of civilizational collapse look for historical analogues to contemporary fragility, the Tang implosion demands to be part of that conversation. Understanding how great powers break requires looking beyond Europe's story of itself. And Lushan's ambition consumed tens of millions. But in the 20th century, ideology, not one man's ego, became history's most efficient engine of mass death. In July 1995, in a town the United Nations had promised was safe, that lesson was still being learned. The blue helmets of the United Nations were supposed to mean something. The women believed it, the children believed it, the men and boys believed it too, right up until they were separated from their families, loaded onto buses and driven to places no one would find them. Srebrenica, July 1995. The town had been designated a UN safe area 3 years earlier, a formal declaration that the international community would not permit what was visibly being permitted everywhere else in Bosnia. Thousands of Bosniak Muslim civilians, displaced, exhausted, terrified, had taken shelter under that declaration, under the Dutch peacekeepers whose mandate said they were there to protect. The mandate, on close reading, allowed observation. It did not compel intervention. This distinction would cost 8,000 people their lives. General Ratko Mladic's Bosnian Serb forces had surrounded the enclave for months. When the final assault came, the Dutch battalion requested air support and was denied, delayed, and bureaucratically stalled until the moment had passed. Mladic walked into Srebrenica with cameras present, handing out candy to children, performing calm for the footage. The separation happened quickly. Women, children, and the elderly were loaded onto buses and told they were being transported to safety. Men and boys, above approximately 12 years old, were told they would be screened and then reunited with their families as part of a prisoner exchange. They were taken to warehouses, schools, and fields, bound with wire, and executed. Over several days, more than 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were systematically killed. The mass graves were later dug up and the bodies moved to secondary sites. A calculated attempt to destroy forensic evidence that only served to scatter the dead further across the landscape, ensuring that the work of finding and identifying them would take decades. International courts ruled it genocide. The evidence was never seriously in dispute. The international community had been watching in real time and had calculated that intervention was not worth the cost. In 2026, Srebrenica remains the definitive case study in what never again looks like when the world doesn't mean it. The monitors were present, the cameras were present, the mandate existed, and 8,000 people were murdered inside the most observed genocide in history. Srebrenica was a genocide hiding in plain sight, witnessed by the international community and still not stopped. But sometimes the most devastating tragedies are invisible. A pill, a prescription, a company that knew and shipped it anyway. The brochure called it the safest sedative ever developed. The sales representatives handed it to physicians with confidence. Physicians prescribed it to pregnant women without hesitation. The company knew the testing was incomplete. They shipped it to 46 countries anyway. Post-war West Germany, 1957. The pharmaceutical industry is operating inside a cloud of optimism that the era seems to generate naturally. Every year brings new drugs, new interventions, new chemistry performing what would have seemed like miracles to the previous generation. Thalidomide, produced by the German company Grunenthal, fits the mood perfectly. Marketed initially as a sedative and then aggressively promoted as a remedy for morning sickness, it carries the aesthetics of absolute safety, non-toxic, non-habit-forming, the modern answer to an ancient discomfort. The testing that had led to these claims had never studied what the compound did to a developing embryo. That question was not asked. It was not an oversight born of ignorance, it was an oversight born of speed and of commercial pressure and of a regulatory environment that had not yet learned to ask it. The children began to be born in 1959. The condition was called phocomelia. Severely malformed or absent limbs, the arms and legs either missing entirely or replaced by shortened, undeveloped approximations. Eyes, ears, and internal organs were affected in thousands more. An estimated 10,000 children worldwide were born with thalidomide-related injuries. In the United States, a single FDA reviewer named Frances Oldham Kelsey refused to approve the drug on the grounds that the safety data was insufficient. She was pressured repeatedly by the manufacturer. She held her position. America was largely spared. In 1962, the scandal broke globally and the drug was withdrawn. What replaced it, slowly and imperfectly, was a completely transformed framework for pharmaceutical approval. Mandatory animal testing across multiple species, including pregnant animals, multi-phase clinical trials, independent review boards, informed consent requirements. Every protection that exists today between a new compound and a pregnant woman's prescription pad was written in part by the children of thalidomide. In 2026, as drugs move to market under accelerated approval pathways and compressed regulatory timelines, thalidomide is not a historical cautionary tale. It is a live warning. Thalidomide showed how the pursuit of profit can poison the most vulnerable people alive. Decades earlier, on the other side of the world, an empire didn't poison a nation's body. It burned its soul. Lord Elgin chose not to burn the Forbidden City. That, he reasoned, would destabilize the government he needed functional to sign his treaty. He needed a target that was personal to the emperor. He needed something that could not be rebuilt with money or time. He chose the garden. Yuan Ming Yuan, the Garden of Perfect Brightness, had been constructed and expanded across 150 years of Qing dynasty rule into something that defied straightforward description. 350 buildings, temples, libraries, European-style fountains built by Jesuit architects, silk, jade, bronze, lacquer, clocks, porcelain. The accumulated artistic heritage of the wealthiest empire on earth gathered into a complex outside Beijing that served as the emperor's spiritual and personal center of gravity. Western visitors who had glimpsed it described it as beyond imagination. The proximate cause was legitimate, or as legitimate as anything in the Second Opium War could be described. Chinese officials had detained and tortured British and French diplomatic envoys who had entered under a flag of truce. 20 of the 37 captured envoys died in Chinese custody. Elgin wanted a response proportional to the insult and calibrated to be felt. The looting came first, 3 days of it, organized and systematic, soldiers filling their packs with whatever they could carry. Silk and bronze and imperial collections that had taken dynasties to assemble were carried out through the gates over 72 hours. Then the burning. 4,000 British troops set fire to the complex on October 18th. The smoke was visible from across Beijing. It burned for days. The ruins were left standing. This was not oversight. It was the point, a permanent monument to what foreign power could do, placed in permanent view of the capital it had humiliated. In 2026, as global debates over the repatriation of colonial artifacts reach peak intensity, Greek marbles, Benin bronzes, Egyptian antiquities, Yuan Ming Yuan's scattered treasures remain in European museums, private collections, and periodic auction houses. The ruins still stand outside Beijing, the charred foundations deliberately preserved, because sometimes what a country chooses to remember it has lost says more than anything in a museum ever could. Elgin's fire destroyed a palace and a piece of a civilisation's memory. Across the Pacific, 5 years later, a broken boiler would destroy something else entirely. The final journey home of men who had already survived everything. These men had survived Andersonville. They had survived Camp Sumter. They had endured the worst prison camps the Confederacy could construct, the starvation, the open sewage, the winter with no shelter, the dead counted every morning. They had made it through the end of the war. They were going home. The river had other plans. the Mississippi River, north of Memphis, before dawn on April the 27th, 1865. The SS Sultana is a paddle-wheel steamboat with a legal passenger capacity of 376. It is carrying over 2,100 people, primarily Union soldiers recently released from Confederate prisoner of war camps, men who are gaunt and sick and sleeping wherever they can find a surface. The reason for the overcrowding was money. The US government paid transport operators a fixed rate per head for repatriating prisoners, and there were corrupt arrangements between the military officials managing embarkation at Vicksburg and the operators willing to pack their vessels beyond all safety. The Sultana's owners had lobbied for the contract. The soldiers were cargo. 3 days before departure, one of the ship's 4 boilers was found to be cracked. A repair was made. It was hasty, performed by a second-rate mechanic using an inadequate patch, and signed off on by men with a schedule to keep. The Sultana left Vicksburg on April the 24th. It stopped at Memphis. It continued north. At approximately 2 a.m. on April the 27th, 3 of the 4 boilers exploded simultaneously. The explosion was heard miles away. Burning coal scattered across decks packed with sleeping men. The wooden superstructure ignited immediately. Many men who survived the blast went into the river, where the current and the cold water, and the fact that most of them were too weakened by imprisonment to swim, killed them before help arrived. Approximately 1,800 people died. It remains the deadliest maritime disaster in American history. Worse than the Titanic, measured by lives lost, Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated 4 days earlier. The newspapers had no room for a steamboat. The Sultana is America's forgotten catastrophe, proof that greed and negligence are as efficient as any weapon, and that American media has always curated which tragedies earn the front page and which ones sink quietly into the river and are not retrieved. The Sultana went down because profit was placed above lives, and no one noticed because a bigger story had the headlines. A century later, in Brussels, 39 people would die in a stadium while officials debated whether to play the game. The stadium was crumbling. Anyone who walked in could see it. The concrete at the back of Block Z was old, and the perimeter wall was the kind of structure that communicated its own fragility to anyone who thought to look. 1 hour before kickoff, this did not seem to be a disqualifying problem. Then 39 people were dead, and it was. Heysel Stadium, Brussels, May 29th, 1985. The European Cup final, Liverpool against Juventus, the most watched club football match of the year, had been awarded to a venue that inspectors had flagged for poor condition. The flags had not been actioned. 58,000 people arrived anyway. Block Z was designated as a neutral section, intended as a buffer between rival supporters. In practice, it was filled primarily with Italian and Belgian Juventus fans, many of them older, many of them families, and it was placed directly adjacent to a section containing Liverpool supporters. The separation was a section of wire fencing and optimism. With approximately an hour before kickoff, a group of Liverpool fans charged across the terrace. Juventus fans retreated from the pressure in the only direction available to them, toward the back wall of Block Z. The wall, old concrete held together by decades of weather and institutional inattention, gave way under the mass of people pressed against it. 39 people were killed. 32 of them were Italian. The majority were crushed in the collapse. The match was played. Officials, police, and UEFA representatives made the calculation that stopping it might provoke further violence inside the stadium from supporters who didn't yet know what had happened outside. It remains one of the most debated decisions in the history of sport. English clubs were banned from European competition for 5 years. Juventus were barred for a year. Stadium safety legislation was overhauled across the continent. Heysel, along with the Bradford Fire and Hillsborough 4 years later, collapsed the comfortable assumption that the venues where millions of people gathered each week were someone else's responsibility. In 2026, the question Heisel poses has not changed. At what point does infrastructure negligence become intent? At what point does known risk become a decision?